Welcome back to part 2 of the Dana 44 swap on this 1988 Jeep Comanche I like to call Project Blue Manche. My name is Thomas and welcome to my channel, Black and Blue Garage. The last video was more of like a montage of taking the brackets off and fitting the truss onto the axle and getting everything where I needed it to be. I ended up taking the truss and tilting it backward about 5 degrees because I knew that I needed to roll the axle forward a little bit to adjust for the lift that it has, which ended up being about 5 inches. I knew that I wanted to take the axle and move it forward as much as possible to get a good approach angle and also clear as much of this fender on the back as I could. So what I did, cut the spring perches off of the truss itself and move them back a couple inches, and that brought it to where they were right on top of the axle tube. Later, I ended up moving the Iron Rock off-road 3-link system forward another 2.5 inches to, mostly because the rod ends were adjusted way too far out when I moved the axle forward. So I moved the cross member of that kit up about 2.5 inches, and then the axle came forward another 1.5 inches for a total of about 3.5 inches. So I cut the tacks on the spring perches for the truss, and I actually slid those pieces back until the front of those spring perches met up with the front of the truss. With those tacked in place, I put the springs back on and put everything back together so that this is sitting on its own weight. Now, I have the truck sitting about the center of the axle using a couple of ratchet straps until I can get a panhard bar or track bar made up for this thing. I'm still on the fence a little bit whether I want to go full hydro steering or steering assist. It all depends on what mechanically will allow. I know that once you push the axle so far forward, your pitman arm and your steering knuckles are going to be past each other, and your pitman arm is going to be running into your panhard bar and so forth. So it may end up where I either have to find a different steering gearbox so that the panhard bar goes forward, or I just decide to do full hydro for this thing. Now, the other concern that I had with this truss was the ARB fitting, where I'd like to put it right underneath the truss. Now, both of the holes that are on top of the axle is right on top of the truss, and worst comes to worst, I could block those off and put an ARB fitting out somewhere else. But what I actually did was drilled a hole through the top of the truss in the exact spot where the ARB fitting actually is. So with that, I know it's kind of a big no-no, like you're weakening that the whole structure of the truss comes from that top piece that goes along from side to side. But I do plan on reinforcing that before I do the final weld of this axle. So to accommodate for that, if you saw the part 1 of this video, the upper link, because it's 3-link system, the upper link on the left hand side was meant to key in right above where that ARB fitting should go, in my opinion. And I was thinking about it, reading reviews on the Iron Rock 3-link kit. A lot of people found that when you full stuff on the left side with this kit, you get issues with the upper link rubbing or hitting or pressing up against the drive shaft. It was only a couple of people that said that online, but that was enough for me to take that information and see where I wanted my ARB fitting, and also notice with this axle in the center, that arm has so much room, the upper link has so much room to move to the left. That upper link mount doesn't have to key in where they have it keyed in. That's just a placement so that you can locate where it's supposed to be. Barnes makes it really easy for you to put these things together, by the way. It is like one of those kids' puzzles. So with the truss rolled back and allows me to get a really good pinion angle on this thing and still have about 5 degrees of camber in my knuckles. So I don't have to cut and turn. It's only 4.5 to 5 inches lifted. So I really lucked out and I don't have to do the extra work. One thing to note is that if you're going to do this job, I would recommend taking your steering knuckles off and completely gutting this axle, because welding, especially if you're using little flux core buzz box like mine, very messy. There's welding and grinding, and if you have any open holes whatsoever, that stuff is going to get in there. I left my gears and everything in there because everything except for maybe the housing and the knuckles is going to be replaced in this axle with better stuff. Another thing about that is putting this axle on jack stands and trying to spin it, and the knuckles are flopping every time it turns over 180 degrees. Made it really difficult to turn this thing over and back and over, because if you're not strapping the axle down to weld it, you want to weld one side and then the other, and then flip it over and weld one side and the other, so that your heat is distributed evenly and the truss and your welding doesn't curl the thing into a smiley face. It wouldn't be very good for your axle or your axle shafts. So if I was to do it again, I would gut the axle and I would pull my knuckles and I would pull my drive shafts and my gears and everything, and I'd have just the housing and I would weld it all together like that. Reason I didn't is because I wanted to get this thing on tires, and I wanted to get this thing on its own suspension, on its own weight, because I don't have crazy money to be putting in this axle right now. The axle shafts from RCVs for a Ford Dana 44 is around $1,800. An ARB is around $1,000. Gears is another few $100. A yoke is another $100. And then you're spending $150 to $200 depending on what bearings and gaskets you buy. And then there's things that, you know, I may need to do with full hydro, like I may have to buy aftermarket knuckles. The RCVs require you to upgrade your lockouts, which is another few $100. So all that said, I don't have that kind of money to be putting into this axle right now, so having everything in there kind of worked out for me. Just keep in mind that there's a safety aspect to it with all that weight slinging around on jack stands. It could roll off the jack stands if you're not careful. Luckily, I'm careful. So where we're at right now is the truss is on, the springs are where they're supposed to be, the links are adjusted, the camber is adjusted, it's got wheels and tires on it, the tires are holding air. So as far as the truss and the axle go, all it really needs is finish welded. Because after that's done, the only thing that needs to happen on the outside of the axle is inner C gusset supports, a couple of brackets for limit straps, and maybe full hydro. So anyways, that's the update for the Dana 44 going into a Jeep Comanche. This thing is way bigger with the offset of these wheels. I think I'm sitting out about 10 to 12 inches. Hope you enjoyed the video. Stay tuned. I'm going to do a full walk around on this thing in a few days while I'm waiting for parts, and while it's late and I don't want to upset the neighbors, I am working on other things around the Jeep. Well, thank you for joining me. I know nobody could be as excited about this as me, but if you're still watching, I really appreciate it. It really helps me out if you would subscribe, like this video, push the notification bell so you can see videos in the future. Thank you.